initiate a preemptive strike against Iran. I will remind our audience you dedicated an entire book to the idea of preemption. So if Bibi or President Obama called you up and said, Professor Dershowitz, I'd like the lowdown on what is the law in terms of preemptive strike, what would you say?
I would say that no country's survival has ever depended on the law. No country will put its survival second to obeying international law principles. So I think to focus on the law is a big mistake. International law, after all, what is international law? International law isn't something that Israel signed on to. Israel's not even allowed to serve on the International Court of Justice. Israel doesn't serve in the Security Council. Israel doesn't serve, maybe it will in the future, but it doesn't now. What is international law? It almost is never legislated. International law is written by professors, mostly. It's the most academic of legal subjects, often untested. Let me give you an example of international law. International law absolutely would prohibit the United States from attacking Moscow with a nuclear bomb if Moscow had attacked New York, Washington, and Los Angeles with a nuclear bomb. International law categorically prohibits the use of weapons of mass destruction or any other weapons against civilian targets, the way the United States did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Absolutely prohibited by international law. And yet the entire Cold War was based on the principle of tit-for-tat retaliation, MAD, mutually assured destruction. Utterly unlawful under international law. If the Prime Minister of Israel were to tell an Israeli pilot to drop a nuclear bomb on Tehran in, God forbid, retaliation against a nuclear bomb being dropped on Tel Aviv, under international law, that soldier would have to refuse that order. He could not drop a bomb on a city. You know that Menachem Begin said in justification for the flight that Danny didn't take and didn't participate in 1981, in justification for the attack on the Osirak nuclear reactor, Begin said very clearly, Israel must engage in preemptive acts because we cannot engage in mutually assured destruction. He said no Prime Minister of Israel, he's speaking for himself of course at the time, would ever order the incineration of 1 million Iraqi babies. No country which comprised largely of the grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors could ever order the incineration of 1 million Iraqi babies. And he said we are now at war with the babies and children of Iraq. And remember the difference between preemption and reaction, response, is that for mutually assured destruction, you always have to target civilians. That's the goal. You kill our 1 million civilians, we'll kill your 1 million civilians. When you engage in preemption or prevention, it's always a targeted military attack. You're always going after a specific military target preemptively and preventively, which is why the 1967 war, which was preemptive in nature, Israel believed it was about to be attacked, and it attacked the Syrian and Egyptian Air Force on the ground. That was the perfect example of a preemptive attack. There were virtually no civilian casualties in the entire 1967 war. It was a clean military war. The large number of civilian casualties were Jews living in Cairo who were attacked by gangs. But the Israeli Air Force attacked solely military targets. And even when Israel had its civilian areas attacked in the beginning of the 67 war by Jordan, when Jordan lobbed bombs into Jerusalem, it did not respond by attacking Amman. Israel did not respond to the 48 attack on the bombing of the Tel Aviv bus station by Egypt by attacking Cairo. It has always focused on military targets. So there's a direct relationship between preemption on the one hand and the selection of military targets on the other hand, rather than relying on after-the-fact retaliation, which is a kind of result of a theory of deterrence. So there are arguments to be made for preemption and prevention. There are arguments to be made against it as well, if it's done too promiscuously and too gratuitously. Preemption and prevention ought to be reserved for situations like the 67 war, where an attack appeared to be imminent, or that's preemption. By the way, the English language distinguishes two words, preemption and prevention. Many other languages don't make that distinction, and it's an important distinction to make. Preemption is preventing an imminent attack that you expect right away by getting the first jump on your enemies that are preparing to attack you. A prevented attack is quite different. It can be 2 years in advance, 3 years in advance. You believe that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. They haven't developed it yet. They're not about to drop it immediately if they develop it. But the only opportunity you have to prevent that from occurring is now. What Begin said in 1981 was the attack has to occur between May and August of that year because the weather was too bad in April, and by September the material would be in the center, and therefore there would be far too much risk of nuclear contamination. By the way, the same thing is true in Iran. There comes a time when an attack on a nuclear reactor would cause far too much nuclear damage. So a preventive attack is certainly possible. I hope it doesn't happen. I think the second worst thing that can happen in the world, the second worst thing, would be a military attack either by the United States or by Israel against Iran's nuclear facilities. Obviously, you know what I'm going to say when I say what the first worst thing is, and that is allowing Iran to develop nuclear weapons and having a policy of containment, which is simply too risky. The idea of containing a regime whose moderate leader, Rafsanjani, moderate leader, said 10 years ago in an interview, if we bomb Tel Aviv and kill 3 million Jews, Israel will retaliate and bomb Tehran and kill 10 million Muslims, and the trade-off would be worth it because it would mean the end of the Jewish state, and there are enough Muslims to continue to survive for many, many centuries to come. When you have leaders who take statements like that, you must take them seriously. As Elie Wiesel once put it, for him the lesson of the Shoah is always believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. So Israel in the end can never outsource the defense of its civilians to any country, no matter how friendly, the United States, the United Nations, the international community, multilateral forces. Israel must always have the ability to defend itself. That doesn't mean it should not use caution in exercising that ability. So my hope is that the military option will never have to be deployed. If it were to be deployed, it would, in my view, be lawful, not that that's a major consideration. And I hope that diplomacy works. If diplomacy doesn't work, I hope that sanctions work. I hope that diplomacy, sanctions, and the realistic military option kept on the table together will persuade the Iranians not to develop nuclear weapons. But if they do try to develop nuclear weapons, the military option certainly has to be seriously considered. Now, let me just raise one other question about the military option and how difficult this is, and I want to put the question to you. How many of you saw the other day in the paper that the supreme leader of Iran called for the leaders of the Jewish community? There are several thousand Iranian Jews, and there is a leadership of the Iranian Jews. And he asked the Iranian Jews to come out and show support for Iran's nuclear program. And they did. I don't know about you, but I read that as a cynical message to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that cynical message was this: if you ever consider bombing our water reactor, our nuclear reactor, we will use human shields. And those human shields will include the Jewish population of Iran. And so, Mr. Prime Minister, if you pull the trigger and attack the nuclear reactors in Iran, you will be responsible for killing hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews. That's how cynical the Iranians are. That's how difficult the military option would be to pursue. And that's why diplomacy, sanctions, and preserving the threat of a military option are far preferable to actually pulling the trigger and employing the military option. You have